most basic level, evolution is a pretty simple idea. If you have a population, it changes over time and in a way that can stay changed, which means it genetically changes. It's as simple as that. So that could mean that within a population of plants, for example, that you get a new variety, something with some different leaves. Doesn't necessarily have to be a new species, but maybe it is. Maybe over time that change creates kind of a genetic boundary, and these plants can no longer breed with these, creating two new species. But either way, any small genetic change that stays in the population is evolution. The concept that life actually changes over time was something that was pretty new in Europe around the 1700s. Few people were starting to think in that direction, and it really started to take hold in the 1800s, as we'll find out with Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace in their theory of evolution by natural selection. However, most people really didn't think that species changed that much over time. Definitely not into brand new species, an idea that's pretty well accepted now. And before I give you some of the evidence that supports this concept that species do change over time and dramatically into brand new species, I want to define what evolution is not. So one, it's not origins. So the Big Bang is an explanation about how the universe started, but that's a very, very different question than evolution. Even the origin of life, how did life start? Did it come here from other planets, like some people think? Or did it evolve out of kind of spontaneous organization of biomolecules on sheets of clay? Well, don't know, but that's a different question. That's a question about origin. How did life start? What we're concerning ourselves with is, once life started, how did it change? And what sort of fingerprints did it leave on Earth that it has changed over time? So let's take a look. A fossil is just any evidence of prehistoric life, and seldom do we get such wonderful detailed examples like these. You can even see the rings in the tree left over here, and really a lot of detail in the fish in the example on the right. More often we're left with little fragments of plants, maybe a leg of a lizard, pollen grains, things like that, maybe shells. But each of them tell their own story. They're a stamp of life that existed in the past that we wouldn't know about otherwise. They tell even a better story when you start putting them together and looking at them in the different layers of rock. And there's a couple of men that were pretty instrumental here in the 1800s or even before. Charles Lyell here on the left wrote this book, Principles of Geology, very influential on Darwin, who carried it with him on his voyage around the world and read it pretty faithfully. Lyell's idea was that the world is changing, and these big events like extinctions are not caused by supernatural events. They're not caused by floods or other things like that that are the result of a supernatural act, but instead a natural act. So when he saw these layers in the rock, he said, I think these were caused by just good old-fashioned erosion, maybe some occasional volcanic activity, things that just have happened from all time and will continue to happen. And that idea is known as uniformitarianism, just that the world is constantly changing at a uniform rate. And he could see in these fossils both new species arising and old species going extinct. But he thought that that was just a natural process. Now, Cuvier had some similar ideas, looked at the same planet, the same fossils, really kind of founded modern paleontology, but his interpretation was a bit different. He said he thought catastrophes were really the bigger driving force when it came to extinctions. And so things like the Missoula floods that we see evidence for over here in Washington State, or even the Columbia River Gorge, were caused by these big floods about 15,000 years ago. And he thought events like that caused extinctions. So we know that there are plenty of species that have gone extinct, like the dodo, just an example, not caused by flooding, but by human hunting. But extinctions are caused by a variety of reasons. But both men looked at the Earth, came up with different explanations, but both agreed that the world is changing, that species go extinct over time, and also observed that new species do show up in the fossil record. We don't have to go digging up in dirt to actually find evidence of past life in their relationships. We can look inside ourselves. Here's an analysis of proteins, hemoglobin in this case. So most animals make hemoglobin. It's the protein that carries oxygen around in our red blood cells. It makes our blood red. And so here is the human DNA down at the bottom, of course, 100% match. And the hemoglobin, same protein, was compared in other animals. As you'd kind of expect, the rhesus monkey had a really similar hemoglobin structure to ours, most of the same amino acids. The mouse was a little less similar, and as the species become less similar, the hemoglobin structure became less and less similar. Kind of what you'd predict if species were to evolve over time, change in their genes that code for these proteins. So there is some more evidence. It's complicated evidence, so it's a little hard to explain briefly. Here's another look at the same sort of thing. This is a genetic analysis concentrating mostly on whales and hippos and showing that they are related. It's kind of a strange idea there, but nonetheless, this is what this paper that came out in 2015 was looking at. I've added some other species up in here since you probably don't know the scientific names. I've added a few of them. This was a genetic analysis looking at several thousand genes and saying how similar, genetically speaking, are all these animals, and tells the same sort of story. All the porpoises here came out pretty similar, genetically speaking, and their next closest relatives, the next ones on the next branch of the animal family tree, were the whales. And interestingly enough, the hippos came out close to that. And as you're looking over here, on this side are the branches of the tree. And so from the hippo here, we can trace back that next branch is things like cattle. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, cattle and hippos look more similar. And as we get further out on the branches, things like ferrets and cats and bats become less and less similar, and so their genetic structure is less similar. Consistent with the idea that life evolved through time and the genes changed gradually. More similar looking species, more closely related, have a more similar genetic structure. So there's a brief summary of the molecular analysis we can look at that points to a common origin of life. All right, so admittedly, molecular evidence, tough to understand. But here's another family tree showing relationships with anatomy from, again, this idea of a common ancestor. So if all of these organisms on the right share one common ancestor that was different, we'd expect that they'd have some similarities in their structures. So what we call that is a homologous structure. So derived from a common ancestor. What would be an example of something that's not homologous? Well, legs or arms that don't come from the same common ancestor. So these guys down here, the octopus or sea star grasshopper, they have a vaguely similar structure and similar function, but they don't have, any of them, bones in them. So not coming from the same common ancestor. But let's return to this tree here for a second and look at it a little more blown up view so we can see the limb of a whale has the same arm bones. They are color coded, and you can kind of pause the video and study these a little bit, but they are the same structure as ours. You have that green humerus, the radius and ulna, wrist bones, finger bones, all the same structures, even though they're very different animals. Could that be coincidence? Maybe, but that seems like quite a coincidence. So it's really good evidence that all of these organisms share a common ancestor, just got modified through time into different types of arm bones. It's a different type of anatomical evidence that we call vestigial structures. And these actually are some type of homologous structure as well, but we say they're vestigial because they're just a vestige, or kind of a shriveled up, useless version of what they might have been in the past or in other related organisms. So for example, the human appendix. It's this little thing off the end of our large intestine that in other organisms is much larger. So we have this thing called a cecum, and something like a horse, theirs is huge. And so they do a lot of their digestion there. Ours is kind of shriveled up. We still have it, indicating that we're related to these other organisms with a larger version of it, but ours is kind of shriveled up. Why would we even have it? Well, just because genetically we haven't gotten rid of it yet. This is one where there's an interesting alternative hypothesis saying the appendix actually does have a use. It's a sort of intestinal flora storage device in case we get diarrhea. But in either case, it still shows this idea of a common ancestor, since others have a similar structure. A couple others real quick. Dew claws, you'll find them in dogs. It's basically a vestigial thumb that they don't particularly use. And then in whales, you will often find hind leg bones, even though they don't have flippers back there. So just some remnant structures that they don't use. Another type of anatomical structure is analogous structures. Now, be really careful on this one. Analogous is very different than homologous. When you tell an analogy, you're telling kind of a fictitious story that stands for something else. So these are not a shared common ancestor. And the example here are two different squirrels that fly, or more accurately glide. They have these flaps of skin between their front and hind legs that allow them to glide from tree to tree. But the sugar glider down here, these cute little guys, are a marsupial mammal like you find around a lot of Australia. Whereas the flying squirrel over here, found throughout North America and even into Europe and Asia, is a placental mammal like us. They would have a belly button. We don't think they're related at all, but since they live in similar forested environments, they both kind of came up with the same solution to a similar problem. We can also look at distribution of other animals around the globe. So this idea of biogeography, bio being life, and you know what geography means. In this case, ratites, large flightless birds. So let's look at some of these guys. So of course we have the ostrich. You're familiar with this one. Big bird, doesn't fly, strong legs, fast runner, lives down here in southern Africa. And there are other similar ones around. You probably know this one, do you? Yeah, that's the emu, and you'll find that in Australia. Then this one, probably a little less familiar. That one's the rhea, and lives in the grasslands of South America. There's even another one, the moa, that's extinct, that used to live in New Zealand. All of them, large flightless birds, they all live in similar habitats. Really wide open, flat grasslands where running would be a big advantage to get away from potential predators and just to get around and find food. So similar solutions to similar problems. The distribution of camels, llamas, alpacas, and even vicuñas, like you see over here on the left, it shows up on this family tree right here, the vicuña. Very, very similar to other related animals that you find all through South America. So in South America, we find these closely related groups of animals. They're all in here. Whereas over in Africa and up into Asia, we find the different types of camels. So camels are very closely related, and so is this other group in South America. But their closest living relatives of all the different mammals out there are in these two continents, because we think with continental drift that Africa and South America essentially have been drifting apart. You can even see how they kind of would fit together if it were a puzzle. So theory goes that millions of years ago, there was a common ancestor that was split up geographically by the Atlantic Ocean, and they both went along their merry way, evolving into these different species. And that's kind of played out in their genetics and proteins and other evidence as well. Well, that's a brief overview of several types of evidence that makes people think that life has evolved over time. And not as little bits like this here, but over long periods of time evolved into new species. Now, this wasn't intended to be something to convince people that don't believe in evolution to suddenly start to believe it. Really, it was more of a brief overview of the evidence that people consider in science when we think that populations change over time and evolve into new species. There's another question, which is, how does that happen? So that was evidence that it did. What about how? In this class, we'll mainly concentrate on evolution by natural selection, but there are a few other mechanisms as well. Let's take a brief look. So there are a lot of mechanisms of evolution, and the basis of all of these is mutation, which is just a change to the DNA. It's often misunderstood. All that a mutation is changed DNA. Often we will see some outward characteristics change as well, since DNA codes for what we look like. And let's just take eyes, for example. Most organisms have just two eyes, just staring at you there. What if a mutation happened that created a third eye? Well, there it is. That's evolution. We have now one individual walking around with three eyes. Kind of weird looking. It's up to these other mechanisms to decide, is this beneficial or is it a hindrance? Should we keep it over time? Should it become more common or not? So the mutation is kind of the basis of creating varieties, and then these other ones determine what happens from there. So we'll talk about natural selection more later. Let's talk about genetic drift and gene flow, though. And for that example, let me just give this example of two hillsides. Let's say they're separated by a long distance. In the case of genetic drift, this would be a random change like a forest fire. Let's look at these two as though they're populations of really poorly drawn trees, and the colors represent different varieties. So in this population, let's say a forest fire raged and came through here, or maybe a flood or lightning. It was a random-ish event and just happened to wipe out all these yellow trees. Now all I have left is a blue tree. That's a random change. That population looks different than it used to, and that's evolution. Now, gene flow would be movement of genes between the two populations. You might ask, how did that blue tree get there? Maybe a seed came, was carried by a bird, and planted on that hillside. That's gene flow. Changes the genetic structure of that population. Well, that's a broad overview of the idea of evolution. My question to you is, how do you think this is relevant to medicine, to human health in general? I'd love to hear your comments or questions in the comment section. Until next time, keep enjoying life.